My husband said, "I'm filing for divorce. You'll get nothing." I quietly smiled and signed. He had no idea that 8 years ago I secretly put all his assets in my name. When he found out, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." I used to think a quiet house meant a peaceful marriage. Our home in Scottsdale, Arizona was exactly that. Quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet you find after a long day, when two people settle into their corners of the couch and breathe easy. No. It was the kind of quiet that sits behind your teeth, tense, watchful, the kind that makes you listen harder than you should. My name is Claire Whitmore. I married Daniel Whitmore 17 years ago in a small ceremony in Sedona. Red rocks behind us, champagne in our hands, his mother already crying at the front row. I was 28. He was 32. I thought I had chosen well. He was charming, confident, a real estate developer with a sharp eye and good instincts. I was a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Phoenix, practical and organized by nature. We looked good together. We made sense. For the first few years, we did more than look good. We built something. We bought land, we invested, we planned. I handled our personal finances with the same precision I brought to my job. Budgets, timelines, documentation. Daniel built the business. It was a fair division, or so I told myself. Looking back, what I called partnership was closer to invisibility. I kept everything running while he kept everything public-facing. The deals, the handshakes, the credit. But love softens perception. For a long time, I didn't let myself see what was in front of me. The first crack appeared about 9 years into the marriage. It wasn't dramatic. It never is at first. Daniel started spending more evenings at the office. That was nothing new. He worked hard, and I respected that. But the pattern shifted. His phone began going face down on the kitchen counter. He stopped mentioning names, co-workers, clients, friends, the way people do when they're carefully editing their speech. He got a second cell phone. He said it was for work. It had a lock code he'd never had before. I didn't confront him. I watched. A woman named Tara Linfield appeared in our social circle around that time. She was younger, early 30s, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who laughed too loudly at other men's jokes and studied you with her eyes while smiling with her mouth. She worked adjacent to Daniel's industry, something in property management. She started showing up at the same dinners, the same charity events. I noticed how Daniel's posture changed when she entered a room. I noticed how he never mentioned her to me first. I am not a dramatic woman. I did not make a scene. I began paying closer attention to everything. Receipts, calendar invites, the timestamps on his messages, when he left his phone unattended for half a minute. What I found wasn't conclusive. Not yet. But it was enough to feel the ground shifting underfoot. Here is what I did instead of panicking. I called an old college friend, Margaret, who'd gone through a brutal divorce 6 years earlier. Over coffee at a place in Tempe we used to go to in our 20s, she told me something I never forgot. "Claire," she said, stirring her cup slowly, "by the time a man tells you he wants out, he's already made his arrangements. The question is whether you've made yours." I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. 8 years ago, 1 year after those suspicions first surfaced, I made a decision. Quietly, carefully, legally. Our accountant at the time, a man named Harold Breen, had mentioned offhandedly during a tax meeting that Daniel held several smaller LLCs under his own name as a liability shield. Standard practice in real estate, he said. But I had been a paralegal long enough to know what that also meant during a divorce. Those assets would be easy to argue as separate property. I began researching. I spoke to an attorney friend. I learned what I needed to learn. And then, over the course of 14 careful months, I restructured. Not everything, not dramatically, just strategically. Several key pieces of property that had been purchased during the marriage using joint funds. I documented every step. I kept records. I said nothing. The house stayed quiet. Daniel and I continued our routines. Dinners on Tuesdays, gym on weekends, holiday cards to his parents. From the outside, we looked like a couple in a comfortable groove. On the inside, I was building something he couldn't see. Then, on a Wednesday evening in March, he came home later than usual. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and the look on his face, that particular mixture of rehearsed calm and suppressed relief, told me before he spoke a word. "I want a divorce, Claire," he said. "My attorney has already drawn up papers. You should know, given how we've structured things, you'll walk away with very little. Maybe nothing." He watched me, waiting for tears, I think, or anger, something he could manage. I smiled, quietly, the way I had practiced in the mirror without knowing I was practicing. "All right," I said. "Send me the papers." He blinked, just once. But I saw it. That night, after Daniel went upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The house felt different already. Not smaller, exactly, but exposed, like a structure with one wall removed. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the sprinklers clicking on outside, the ordinary sounds of a life that was about to be dismantled, or at least that's what he believed. I am not going to pretend I felt nothing. I did. Fear arrived first, quiet and insistent, the way it always does when something you've been anticipating for years finally materializes. Despite everything I had done, the careful, methodical steps I'd taken over 8 years, there was still that primitive, cold-palmed fear that I had missed something, that his attorneys were sharper than mine, that a judge would see things differently, that I would be wrong. I had given 17 years to this marriage, not passively, actively, daily. I had managed our household accounts, coordinated our tax filings, tracked our property investments. When Daniel's first big development deal nearly collapsed in 2011, it was my analysis of the contract language that found the clause that saved it. He celebrated with his business partners at a steakhouse downtown. I stayed home and reordered the files. That was the thing about Daniel that I had spent years softening in my mind. He did not see me. Not really. I was infrastructure. Efficient, reliable, easy to overlook. And like all infrastructure, he assumed I'd be there, doing my job, right up until the moment he decided he no longer needed me. Tara Linfield, I was fairly certain, had something to do with the timing. I had no proof of the affair, not the kind that holds up in an Arizona courtroom anyway, but I had watched the two of them long enough to understand the shape of it. The way she touched his arm at the Hendersons' holiday party. The weekend conference in Sedona he had attended last fall, alone supposedly, and the hotel charge I had cross-referenced on a credit statement that didn't match the venue he'd named. Arizona is a no-fault divorce state. The affair itself wouldn't change the math much, but it told me everything about his character and about hers. What would I actually lose if I did nothing? I sat there at that table and made myself answer that question honestly. Daniel's attorney had clearly framed the narrative already. The businesses were his, the LLCs were structured in his name, the real estate empire was his creation. I was a supportive spouse. In a no-fault state with careful asset shielding, supportive spouse could mean very little in dollar terms, except that it wasn't quite accurate anymore, because of what I had done. quietly, 8 years ago. I had not stolen anything. I had not forged anything. I had restructured, legally, assets that were marital property purchased with joint funds during our marriage, into entities I controlled. It had taken patience, documentation, and the help of 2 attorneys who specialized in family asset planning. I had used funds from my own paralegal income, accumulated over years, to pay for it privately. Daniel had no reason to look at any of it, and he hadn't. Why would he? In his mind, I was the woman who organized the filing cabinet. The plan I had built 8 years ago was not about revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was about protection. Margaret's words had stayed with me, and I had simply refused to be the woman caught unprepared. I had not known for certain there would be a divorce. I had hoped there wouldn't be. But hope, I had learned, was not a legal strategy. Now, sitting in my kitchen at nearly midnight, I pulled out a legal pad and wrote down 3 columns. What I have, what he thinks I have, what he doesn't know. The 3rd column was the longest. In total, the properties and entities I had restructured represented approximately 60% of what I estimated to be the real marital estate. The actual combined wealth built during our marriage, before Daniel had begun the slow process of obscuring assets into his own LLCs post-2019. He had been planning, too. He just hadn't started as early or as carefully as I had. My first step was clear. I needed my own attorney, not the one I had consulted years ago during the restructuring. That relationship needed to remain confidential, but a divorce attorney in Phoenix with experience in high-asset cases. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by Daniel's posture or his firm's reputation. Her name came to me almost immediately. Sandra Okafor. I had encountered her name twice in professional contexts, once in a continuing education seminar, once in a case summary my firm had reviewed. She was known for 2 things, precision and composure. I made a mental note to call her first thing in the morning. The second step was documentation. I already had it, years of it, organized and stored not in our home office where Daniel had access, but in a small rented storage unit in Mesa I had maintained since the beginning. Bank statements, property filings, transfer records, LLC registrations, a paper trail so clean it could withstand scrutiny from any direction. The 3rd step was patience. Whatever Daniel and his attorney were planning, they had a picture of the estate in their heads. That picture was wrong, and I was going to let the legal process reveal exactly how wrong it was, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, at the exact moment it would be most difficult for him to adapt. I closed the legal pad. I washed my coffee cup. I went upstairs. Daniel was already asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment. The room we had shared for 12 years, the California King, the blackout curtains he preferred, the nightstand stacked with his industry magazines. And I felt something shift inside me. Not hatred, not grief exactly. Something quieter. Finality. I went to the guest room. I slept better than I had in months. Sandra Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Camelback Road, with a view of the mountains that made the whole city look small and manageable. She was not what I expected, or perhaps she was exactly what I needed. A woman in her late 40s, unhurried, with the kind of stillness that comes from having heard everything twice. She wore no jewelry except small gold earrings. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "You've been holding this for 8 years," she said. Not a question. "Yes. And you documented everything. Thoroughly." She picked up her pen. "Then let's get to work." That meeting changed the texture of the whole situation. Until that morning, everything I had built had existed only in my own mind and in paper records, sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit in Mesa. Saying it aloud to an attorney, watching her take notes, watching her face register not surprise but professional interest, made it real in a different way. The strategy had moved from private to active. Sandra's first move was to file a formal response to Daniel's divorce petition within the allowable window. The response was measured, almost bland on the surface. No aggressive claims, no dramatic declarations. It simply noted that the petitioner's characterization of marital assets was incomplete and that the respondent reserved the right to present a full accounting, standard legal language. But it sent a signal. Daniel's attorney, a man named Richard Voss, senior partner at a firm I recognized, called Sandra's office the next morning. I was not on that call, but Sandra relayed its substance to me that afternoon. Voss had been expecting a quick settlement negotiation. He had not expected us to challenge the asset characterization. He was, in Sandra's measured words, recalibrating. Good. I went back to my routines. I went to work. I came home. Daniel and I existed in the house like two objects that occupied the same space without touching. Polite at the margins, careful with words. He stopped leaving his phone face down. He had moved to keeping it on him entirely now. Tara Linfield had gone quiet on social media. I noticed that too. It was during the third week of March that something shifted in Daniel's behavior. He began watching me differently. Not openly. Daniel was too controlled for that. But I caught it in peripheral moments. The way he paused when he passed my home office. The way he asked, with studied casualness, whether I had found a good attorney yet. The question was meant to sound considerate. It landed like a probe. Yes, I said. She's excellent. He nodded, moved on. But that evening, I heard him on the phone in his car. I was walking back from getting the mail, and he hadn't seen me approach. And though I caught only fragments, I heard Richard Voss's name, and I heard the words, "What does she actually have access to?" So, he was beginning to wonder. The moment that crossed from suspicion to certainty, for both of us in different ways, came on a Thursday afternoon in early April. Sandra called me as I was leaving work. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning," she said. "I have something to show you." Her tone was composed as always, but there was a precision to it that told me this was significant. I arrived at her office at 8:30. On her desk was a document, a financial disclosure filed by Daniel's attorney as part of the divorce proceedings, the required declaration of assets. I read through it in silence. He had listed 11 properties. I knew of 14. He had listed 3 business entities. I knew of 6. Several accounts were absent. The document was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate misrepresentation of the marital estate. "That's perjury," I said. "It's a declaration under penalty of perjury," Sandra said carefully. "Yes." I sat with that for a moment. I had known Daniel was calculating. I had known he was, in his way, ruthless. The kind of ruthlessness that wore a professional face and called itself strategy. But sitting in that office, reading the list of things he had chosen to erase, I felt something cold and clarifying settle over me. He had not just tried to leave me with nothing. He had lied in a legal filing to make that happen. I thought about the woman I had been at 28, standing in Sedona with champagne in her hand. I thought about the 12 years of household management, the 2011 contract clause, the holiday cards to his parents. I thought about Tara Linfield's hand on his arm at the Hendersons' party. Then I thought about the storage unit in Mesa, The files, the property records, the 8 years of quiet, patient preparation. "What do we do next?" I asked Sandra. She turned to her computer and pulled up a document. "We file a motion for full financial disclosure and request a forensic accounting." She looked at me over her glasses. "And then we show them what you actually own." That was the moment of no return. Not the night Daniel had said the words across the kitchen table. Not the morning I had called Sandra's office. This office, this document, this decision was where the road behind me dissolved. I nodded. "Do it," I said. The forensic accountant Sandra retained was a woman named Patricia Huang, who had spent 12 years at the IRS before going private. She was methodical, humorless, and apparently impossible to intimidate. I liked her immediately. Over the following 2 weeks, Patricia and Sandra's team began the formal process of reconstructing the true marital estate, pulling deed records, LLC filings, bank histories, and transfer documents. The storage unit in Mesa, which I had maintained for 8 years, became the center of gravity for the case. I drove there on a Saturday morning with Sandra's paralegal, a quiet young man named Theo, and we spent 4 hours going through everything, box by careful box. Theo didn't say much, but at one point he looked up from a stack of property transfer documents and said, almost to himself, "You were ready." "I hoped I wouldn't need to be," I said. That was true. I had never wanted this. I had wanted a marriage. I had simply refused to be unprepared if one day I didn't have it. The legal filings began going in. Sandra's motion for full financial disclosure landed on Richard Voss's desk on a Wednesday. The request for forensic accounting followed the next morning. The effect was, by Sandra's account, immediate. Voss called twice that day. He was no longer recalibrating. He was alarmed. I was at my desk at work when my personal cell phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Claire." It was Daniel. Not his usual register, the controlled business meeting voice he used when he wanted to project authority. This was quieter, tighter. "Richard tells me your attorney is requesting a forensic accounting." "That's correct," I said. A pause. "That's going to cost both of us a significant amount of money and time." "Probably," I agreed. "Claire, I think we should talk, directly, without the attorneys involved." I said nothing for a moment, watching the afternoon light move across my desk. "Everything should go through our attorneys, Daniel." And I ended the call. I had barely set the phone down when Sandra sent me a message. Voss just called. They want to schedule a settlement conference. Hold position. I held position. What came next I had not fully anticipated, though perhaps I should have. 2 days later, on a Friday evening, there was a knock at the front door. I opened it to find Tara Linfield standing on my porch. She was wearing sunglasses despite the fading light, which struck me as deliberately theatrical. She smiled. It didn't reach anything. "I just thought we should talk, woman to woman," she said. I looked at her. "We don't know each other well enough for that conversation," I said, "and this is still my home. I'd like you to leave." Her smile didn't waver. "You're making this very difficult for everyone, Claire. Daniel just wants a clean break. If you keep pushing with this forensic thing, it's going to get messy. For you, too." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." I met her eyes for a long moment. "Good night, Tara," I said, and closed the door. I stood on the other side of it, breathing slowly, my hand still on the knob. Was it a threat? Yes. An amateurish one. The kind people make when they're frightened and want to appear more powerful than they are. She'd come to my door because something in the legal filings had scared them enough to try a different approach. That told me everything I needed to know about how exposed they felt. I called Sandra immediately. She listened, then said with quiet satisfaction, "Document the time. What she said, exactly. Witness intimidation is not something judges take lightly." I wrote it all down that night, signed and dated it, and emailed it to Sandra's office. The following Monday, Sandra filed an addendum noting the contact. Voss apparently called her within the hour. The word Sandra used to describe his tone was flustered. I had not seen Richard Voss flustered before, even secondhand. Daniel, for his part, went silent. No more calls. No more kitchen table encounters. He moved to a short-term rental in Tempe, which told me his attorney had counseled him to vacate the marital home before things escalated further. And then, something unexpected happened. After weeks of tension, of legal filings and late-night note-taking, and the relentless low-grade vigilance that had become my baseline, I crashed. Not dramatically, just quietly. Bone-deep exhaustion. I took 4 days off work. I drove to Sedona, yes, the same red rocks, and rented a small casita outside the main drag. I brought books I didn't read and wine I barely touched. I walked in the mornings and sat on the porch in the evenings and let myself feel the full weight of what the last year had actually cost me. The loneliness I had been too busy to grieve, the marriage I had believed in long past when I should have. I cried once, on the second evening, watching the light go amber over the rocks. Not for Daniel, for the version of myself who had stood in that same landscape 20 years ago and believed she was beginning something beautiful. Then I came home, steadier than I'd left. I returned from Sedona on a Tuesday. The house was cool and silent, and I walked through it slowly, room by room, the way you assess a place after an absence, noticing what you'd stopped seeing. The California King with its blackout curtains, now mine alone. Daniel's industry magazines gone from the nightstand. The kitchen where I had smiled quietly and watched him fail to understand what he'd just triggered. It was different now, that silence. Less like a held breath and more like an exhale. The first overture came on Thursday. Daniel's mother, Gloria, called. She was 71, a woman I had genuinely liked for most of my marriage. Sharp, old-fashioned, privately kind. She had sent me birthday cards every year without fail. I answered. "Claire, sweetheart," she said, and her voice had that particular careful warmth of someone who had been coached. "I've been worried about you. I know this is a terrible time. Would you come to lunch? Just us." I paused. Was this orchestrated? Almost certainly. But Gloria herself was not a villain, and I had no interest in treating her as one. "I appreciate you calling, Gloria," I said gently, "but I don't think it's appropriate right now, given the legal situation. I hope you understand." A brief silence. "He's making a mistake, you know," she said quietly. Off script, I thought. "I've told him." "I know you have," I said. And then, because it was true, "That means something to me." We said goodbye warmly. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment afterward, thinking about how many casualties there were in a marriage's end beyond the two people at the center. Then I set the phone down and went back to reviewing the documents Sandra had sent. The second overture was less gentle. Richard Voss himself called Sandra to propose what he framed as a preliminary settlement conversation. Informal, off the record, meant to reduce friction for both parties. Sandra relayed it to me with her usual composure and added, "He specifically suggested you consider withdrawing the forensic accounting request in exchange for a more generous asset split offer." What was the offer? 35% of the declared estate. The declared estate. The incomplete one. The one missing 3 properties and 3 business entities. No, I said. That was my recommendation as well. Tell him we'll see everything in court. What they were offering me was a larger slice of a deliberately shrunken pie, and they were betting that I didn't know the pie was shrunken, or that I was frightened enough to take what I could get and disappear quietly. The cold clarity I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was something more useful than anger. It was certainty. I had spent years being the woman who made things run smoothly while receiving no credit. The woman who found the clause in the 2011 contract and stayed home while he celebrated. The woman who was infrastructure. I was done performing gratitude for inadequate offers. The social support I found during those weeks surprised me, and I think it may have saved me from the kind of isolation that makes people make bad decisions. Margaret, my college friend, drove up from Tucson on a Saturday and stayed the weekend. She brought groceries and cooked elaborate meals and let me talk until I had emptied myself out. Her own divorce had been devastating. She'd walked away with far less than she deserved. And she had rebuilt slowly, methodically, building a consulting practice that now supported her comfortably. She never once said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. 2 colleagues from my firm, women who had known me for years in a professional but not intimate way, reached out once word circulated through the office grapevine. Janice Paulson, a senior paralegal, took me to lunch and said with characteristic directness, "You have access to better legal knowledge than 90% of people going through divorce. Use it." She wasn't wrong. My years in family law-adjacent work had given me a literacy that I was, finally, deploying in my own interest. The third person was unexpected. My neighbor, Deborah, a retired school teacher in her mid-60s who had lived 3 houses down for a decade and brought me soup when I'd had a bad flu 3 winters ago. She knocked on my door one evening with a bottle of wine and said simply, "I saw his car leave with boxes. I just wanted you to know that this block is rooting for you." I laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes up from somewhere low and surprises you, for the first time in months. These women were not a legal strategy, but they were something the last several years had quietly starved me of, the reminder that I existed in a context beyond my marriage, that I was seen, that I was, by people with no stake in the outcome, considered worth showing up for. Daniel and Tara, I suspected, had expected me to be alone, diminished, scrambling. Instead, I was sleeping 8 hours, reviewing documents with clear eyes, and eating Janice's recommended Thai takeout at my clean kitchen table, alone and entirely fine. Let them calculate that. It was a Sunday afternoon in late April when they came together. I saw Daniel's car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. The slate-gray Range Rover he'd always over-maintained, waxed like something precious. Tara was in the passenger seat. I watched them sit there for a moment before getting out, which told me they had been rehearsing something. I could have not answered the door. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I decided I wanted to see what they had prepared. I opened the door before they knocked. Daniel looked not good. The confidence he wore like a second skin had thinned. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there in March. He was dressed carefully, which meant he was trying, which meant he was nervous. Tara stood a half step behind him, her face arranged into something meant to convey sincerity. It was the most effort I had ever seen her put into an expression. "Claire," Daniel said, "thank you for opening the door. We just want to talk." "5 minutes," I said. I did not invite them inside. He took a breath. "I've been thinking about how this has all unfolded, and I think, we both think, that things have gotten more adversarial than they need to be. We're not your enemies, Claire." We. The word was a small flag I noted and set aside. I just want what's fair, I said. Of course, he said, and now his voice shifted into the register I recognized. Warmer, gentler, the voice he had used to close deals and charm clients for 20 years. And I want that for you too. That's actually why we came. I've had a lot of time to reflect, and I think my initial approach was, it was wrong. You deserve more than what Richard first proposed. Tara nodded beside him, a performance of solidarity. We were thinking, Daniel continued, that we could settle this privately. Keep it out of court. Spare both of us the time and the cost and the exposure. You'd get the house, the Scottsdale account, some of the Chandler property. 40%, easily. Maybe more, depending on how we structure it. 40% of what he had declared, which was, I knew, a fraction of what actually existed. I looked at him steadily. And in exchange? He paused, just briefly. You'd withdraw the forensic accounting request. There it was. I had known this was coming. The shape of it, the logic of it. But hearing it spoken aloud in my own driveway, with Tara Linfield standing 3 feet from me, wearing the face of someone reasonable, made something crystallize in a way that was almost clarifying. They weren't here to reconcile. They weren't here to be fair. They were here because Patricia Huang and her forensic accounting team were doing their work, and the picture that was emerging frightened them. They were here to stop me. Daniel, I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice was. I appreciate you driving over. I understand what you're trying to do. I looked at Tara briefly, then back at him. The answer is no. My attorney will handle everything from here. Tara's composure cracked first, just slightly. A tension around her jaw, a sharpness behind the eyes. Claire, you're being unreasonable. Do you know what happens if this goes to full litigation? It becomes public record. Your whole life is on display. Is that what you want? Is that a concern for my privacy or yours? I asked. Silence. Daniel's face had changed. The warmth was gone. Something harder and more honest had replaced it, and I actually preferred it. It was the face I had been negotiating against for 2 years without knowing it. You're going to make this much more difficult than it needs to be, he said. His voice was flat. I'm going to make it accurate, I said. That's all. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the Range Rover. Tara followed, her heels sharp on the driveway concrete. She didn't look back. I stood in the doorway until they pulled out of the cul-de-sac, then I closed the door and leaned against it. My hands were not shaking. I noticed this with something like interest. A year ago, a conversation like that would have leveled me. Now I felt, not triumphant exactly, more like a person who had been tested by something and found that they were still standing. But there was fear, too. A real, practical fear. Not of Daniel, exactly, but of what people do when they become desperate. He had lied on a legal filing. He had sent Tara to my door. He had now come himself, and when that failed, he had dropped the warm voice and shown me the harder thing underneath. What came next when all of that failed? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to let the fear answer for me. I called Sandra that evening and walked her through every word of the conversation. She listened without interruption. Then, you handled that perfectly, and you have a witness this time. Anyone see them at the door? Deborah, my neighbor, had been watering her plants across the street. She had seen the Range Rover. She had seen Tara. Yes, I said. Good, said Sandra. And for just a moment I heard something in her voice that wasn't quite professional, something that sounded almost like pride. The The settlement conference was scheduled for the second week of May in a conference room at a neutral attorney's office in downtown Phoenix. I wore gray, not to be unremarkable. I'm past the age of trying to disappear. But because it was the color of the morning, of the mountains, of things that endure. Sandra was beside me in her habitual navy. Patricia Huang, the forensic accountant, sat to my left with a binder so organized it looked architectural. Across the table, Richard Voss, a junior associate I didn't recognize, and Daniel, who had dressed the way he always did when something important was at stake. Dark suit, no tie, the careful projection of a man in control. He did not look in control. He looked like a man who had spent several weeks receiving news he hadn't expected, trying to prepare for a conversation he didn't know how to prepare for. Voss opened. He was polished, as always. A methodical recitation of their position, the assets declared, the proposed settlement framework. He spoke for 11 minutes. It was a good performance. If I had only been listening to the surface, it might have sounded reasonable. Sandra let him finish. Then she said simply, "Thank you, Richard. Patricia, would you walk us through the accounting?" Patricia opened her binder. What happened next took about 40 minutes, and I will remember every minute of it. Patricia walked through the marital estate as it actually existed. Not as Daniel had declared it, but as the documentary record revealed it. Property by property, LLC by LLC, account by account. She was methodical and entirely without drama. She spoke the way a person speaks when they are simply describing what exists, with no need for emphasis or persuasion. The numbers did the work. 3 properties not declared: the Tempe commercial lot, the parcels in Prescott Valley, the Flagstaff rental unit Daniel had transferred into a shell entity in 2020, which Patricia traced through a 3-step ownership chain with the patience of someone who had once investigated international tax fraud and found this, by comparison, straightforward. 2 undisclosed accounts, a business entity listed under a cousin's name, Daniel's cousin Marcus, with whom he had been doing business for 11 years, a relationship I had mentioned to Sandra casually months ago and which Patricia had treated with the seriousness it deserved. Voss sat through the first 15 minutes with professional stillness. Around minute 20, he leaned over and said something quiet to Daniel. Daniel shook his head once, sharply. By minute 30, Voss had stopped taking notes. Daniel's face during all of this was the most honest I had ever seen it. Not because he was being honest, he wasn't, not voluntarily, but because when the architecture of a deception is dismantled in real time, in front of witnesses, the face tends to reveal what the voice has been concealing. He went through several expressions in close succession: confusion, performative, then recalibration, visible, then something that looked very much like the realization that the situation was beyond what he had prepared for. At one point, he said, "Some of those transfers have explanations." "I'm sure they do," Sandra said pleasantly. "You'll have the opportunity to provide them to the judge." Voss called for a recess. In the hallway outside, I stood near the window with Sandra. The city spread below us, flat, grid-like, sun-bleached. I could see the mountains in the distance, the same mountains I had looked at from Sedona, from this office building on Camelback, from the driveway of my house on 100 ordinary mornings. "He's going to try to negotiate," Sandra said quietly. "Let him," I said. We went back into the room. Voss had composed himself. He was a professional, and professional composure is its own kind of armor. He proposed a revised framework, more properties included, closer to actual value, Still not full disclosure, but significantly more than what they'd opened with. Sandra looked at me. I thought about the kitchen table. The face Daniel had made when I smiled and didn't cry. The storage unit in Mesa. Tara on my porch in her sunglasses. The Sunday driveway visit. The 40% of a shrunken pie. We want full disclosure and an equitable split of the actual marital estate, I said. Not a negotiated fraction of it. If Mr. Whitmore would like to avoid the judge reviewing Patricia's accounting and his declaration under penalty of perjury, I'd suggest he consider that. The words penalty of perjury landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Daniel looked at me directly for the first time that day, and I saw it. The thing I had not seen since that Wednesday in March at the kitchen table, when he had watched me smile and hadn't known what it meant. He was recalculating, trying to find the angle, looking for the version of events where he still came out ahead. There wasn't one. I held his gaze and said nothing. He looked away first. The settlement was reached 3 weeks later. Not in a conference room this time, but through a series of calls between Sandra and Voss that I was not present for, which Sandra relayed to me in clean summaries each evening. She had advised me to stay out of it. Let the attorneys be the voices. You've already made your position clear. She was right. I didn't need to be in the room anymore. The room had already been won. I was at work when Sandra called on the morning of the 28th with the final terms. 62% of the actual marital estate. The estate as Patricia Huang had documented it, not as Daniel had declared it. The Scottsdale house, which I wanted to keep and which Daniel had expected to force a sale of. The Chandler property and the Tempe commercial lot. A share of the business entity revenue over the next 4 years, structured into the agreement. My own retirement accounts, untouched. A dollar amount in liquid assets that made me sit very still for a moment when Sandra read it aloud. Is he challenging anything? I asked. No, she said. Richard called me this morning. Daniel has accepted. I sat at my desk and looked out at the parking lot. An ordinary view, the kind you stop seeing entirely after enough time. Sunlight on asphalt, a woman loading groceries into her car, a man in a hard hat on his phone. And the perjury issue, I asked. Sandra paused. That's a separate matter. My understanding is that his attorney has advised him strongly. I expect there will be a quiet amended filing. Whether the court pursues it further is outside our control. It wasn't the criminal consequence I might have wanted in the abstract, but I had never been primarily in pursuit of punishment. I had been in pursuit of what was mine, and that, now, was secured. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later in a Maricopa County courtroom. The judge reviewed the settlement, asked a handful of procedural questions, and signed. It took less than 30 minutes. 17 years of marriage, closed in the time it takes to watch a television episode. I drove home afterward and sat in my car in my own driveway, my driveway, and let myself feel whatever was there to feel. It was quieter than I expected. Not triumphant exactly, though the victory was real and complete. More like the feeling after a very long and very difficult journey, when you have finally arrived somewhere you recognize as safe. As for Daniel, word reached me in the months that followed, the way word does in a professional community that isn't as large as it pretends to be. The forced financial disclosure had been damaging. Not criminally, as Sandra had anticipated, but in the business community where reputation functions as currency. 2 investors whose money was tied up in the shell entities retained their own accountants. 1 deal in Prescott Valley collapsed. a business partner in the commercial lot venture began asking questions Daniel couldn't answer without implicating himself further. And Tara Linfield, who had stood on my porch in her sunglasses and offered observations, had apparently moved in with Daniel shortly after he vacated the marital home. By autumn, the relationship had fractured. I heard this from Janice, who had heard it from someone at the county recorder's office. I felt nothing about it except a distant, mild satisfaction, the way you feel when a prediction you made years ago turns out to have been accurate. Daniel was not destroyed. He was diminished. His company survived. Smaller, his life continued. But the confident, untouchable version of himself, the one who had sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me I would get 0, that version did not survive. I did not spend time thinking about him. There was too much else to attend to. I hired a contractor to repaint the guest room where I had slept through the hardest months, a warm terracotta the color of Sedona at dusk. I booked a trip to Portugal that I had been postponing for 3 years. I had dinner with Margaret, with Janice, with Deborah. I went back to Sandra's office, this time to write a referral letter so effusive she told me, laughing, that I was going to embarrass her. I did not care. I was not rebuilding my life. I was, for the first time in a long time, simply living it. The difference was significant. Lisbon in October is the color of old gold. I had arrived on a Thursday morning, bleary from the overnight flight, and walked out of the airport into air that smelled like the sea, and something baking nearby, and I stood on the sidewalk with my single suitcase and thought, this is what the other side of it feels like. I stayed for 3 weeks. I had originally booked 10 days. I extended it twice, for the simple reason that there was nothing pressing me back, and I had not felt that particular freedom, the freedom of being beholden to no schedule that wasn't my own, in a very long time. Lisbon's neighborhoods are built on hills, and I walk them slowly, the way a person walks when they are trying to remember what their own pace is. I ate sardines and drank wine at tables small enough to seat only one, and I read books without having to plan around anyone else's preferences. One evening, I sat at a Miraduro, watching the Tagus go silver in the fading light, thinking about the storage unit in Mesa. 8 years, 14 quiet months of careful restructuring, hundreds of documents, the paralegal's instinct applied to my own survival. I did not regret any of it. I regretted the marriage that had made it necessary. There is a difference. I came home to Scottsdale in November with a good tan and 3 bottles of Portuguese wine. The house, my house, had been repainted, the terracotta guest room bright and warm when I stepped in to set down my bag. Deborah had left a small potted succulent on my porch with a note that read only, "Welcome back." I watered it and put it in the kitchen window where it still sits. The months that followed were quiet in the good way, the comfortable kind, the kind I had been mislabeling for years. My professional life shifted. The clarity the divorce process had given me, the realization that I had spent years applying my skills in service of other people's interests while systematically underselling my own, made the decision easier. I left the paralegal firm in February and joined a boutique financial planning practice that specialized in asset protection for women navigating major life transitions. It was, in every meaningful sense, the exact work I had been doing informally for years. Now I was doing it formally, for pay, for women who needed what I had quietly built for myself. I was good at it. I should not be surprised by this. I am not. Daniel's world, by contrast, had contracted. The financial disclosure fallout moved slowly, but with the inevitability of water finding its level. The Prescott Valley development collapsed. A lawsuit from a former investor arrived in the spring, seeking an accounting of funds the forensic process had illuminated. Daniel had not been charged criminally. But the civil exposure was real, and the reputational damage was the kind that doesn't repair easily. As for Tara, she had left him by October amid considerable acrimony. She had stood on my porch in her sunglasses and told me my life was going to get messy. What had actually gotten messy was theirs. She relocated to Denver and started over. Good luck to her, genuinely. I mean that in the most neutral possible way. The things that actually made my life good had nothing to do with their failures. Margaret visited in April and we spent a weekend outside Sedona. The same red rocks, entirely different context. We talked about her consulting practice, my new job, a man she was cautiously seeing. We talked about what it takes to rebuild something after the original structure is gone, not as survivors of damage, but as architects of something new. I turned 50 in July. I had a dinner party. 11 people. My kitchen table extended to its full length for the first time in years, full of voices and food and the warmth of people who chose to be there. Janice, Deborah, Sandra, who turned out to be surprisingly funny in a social setting, Margaret, who arrived first and stayed latest. I looked around that table at some point in the evening when the wine had been opened and someone was laughing at something Deborah had said, and I thought, this is what I was protecting all those years. Not the assets, this, the right to be seen, the right to be present in my own life, the right to sit at my own table and be, without apology, enough. If this story has a lesson, it's the one Margaret gave me over coffee all those years ago. By the time someone tells you the game is over, they've already been playing for a while. The question is whether you have been too. I prepared because I loved myself enough not to be caught off guard. Not because I wanted a war, because I refused to lose one. What would you have done in my place? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And take care of yourself before you need to. Thank you for listening.